Hello. I've watched many videos on YouTube for hive design, for beehives. I seek to blend the best ideas into one design. So I'm going to present to you now this hive design. So what you are looking at here is a design for a long horizontal beehive where supers can be stacked on top. Now you'll see two here. They're both made for 8 frames, but one is half the size of the other, but they both have the same basic design. Normally, supers are not stacked on top of long horizontal hives because people want to keep the height low. But with these, the total height is around 45 inches. The top of the brood box is around 30 inches. The top of the super box, which is a medium super, is around 36 inches. So all of these heights are comfortable to work with. So now I'm going to take the whole hive apart and build it so you can see part by part how this design works. First thing I'm going to do is remove all of the parts and bring them down one by one. First we see the legs here, which are built at an angle to give a wider base for more stability to the hive. And the legs are cut down so that the hive can sit on top of a part of the leg with more stability. Okay, so here, going to place a plywood. The thickness doesn't matter at this time, it's just a plywood base. And underneath that plywood are some slats standing up to give structural integrity in case the plywood wants to warp downwards. So that rests on the legs, and then around that is a base that goes around and leaves one part open here in the front, because this is where the trays are going to be slid in to look for mites and other things. And this space down here below the hive actually creates a dead air space, which is important from some of the videos I've watched to get that dead air space below the hive, because as cold air comes into the hive, it gives that cold air a place to settle away from the cluster, for example, in wintertime. And you'll see that over here to the left, there's an opening for the air, for the ventilation. And so normally the ventilation will come in from one side, on the downwind side of the wind, and that creates a suction to actually softly pull air through the hive. So this base right here is functional for ventilation, for dead air space, for winter ventilation, and for putting in trays to detect mites. Okay, so let's continue on building. What we see now is a base that will go underneath the brood box. Now this base is basically 2 frames stacked together. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. And you'll see between the 2 frames is a mesh screen for a mesh screen board underneath the hive. So as the bees are cleaning themselves, mites will fall through this and fall into the tray down below. Now this is not attached to anything yet. So there needs to be something to hold this up against the base of the hive, because the hive is sitting on the base that surrounds this framework. So as you can see at this point in time, there's the ventilation off to the left and the dead air space down below, and trays can be slid into this open space to catch mites. And these 2 frameworks can actually come apart. I'll move the lower one down, slide it out. So you can see the lower framework has the mesh on top of it, and it can just drop. So if there are a lot of dead bees below the hive, this will just drop, and it's easy just to sweep it off, clean it off, while the framework above it stays in place, being attached to the base of the hive. Let's go ahead and put that back in. So now we just need a few more things to hold that screen up. So now underneath this framework, I have placed some blocks, and you'll see that the blocks in the back are slanted upwards. That's so that this framework with the mesh can be slid back, and then it rises up those ramps until it sets into place. And then these blocks up front, go ahead and show these blocks up front, are then put into place to push that mesh up into place. So then you'll have this 3/4 inch, half-inch space below the frames of the brood box to where the bees can walk around, move around, and it can be easily cleaned out. There's just one more detail to put the cover in front of the space, slat across this to cover in the space. So the only ventilation coming in through this space during the wintertime would be through that ventilation slat on the left there. So let me bring in and put in that covering slat. Okay, I brought in a slat here to put on the front, and that will close off the base. So now we have a dead air space down below with a screened mesh bottom board, ready for the hive to be set on top. So here I have put the brood box onto the bottom base, and you can see that it's split into 2 hives with a divider board down the center. And you'll see that the entrances for the 2 hives are offset a little bit from the center. One comes in the front, one comes in the back. And the idea to have these entrances close to this divider board is that the bees will set up their brood close to the entrance on both of these sides. And the key here is that on one side you'll have the cluster during the winter setting up next to this divider board between the 2 hives. And you'll have the other hive setting up its cluster very close to this divider board. What actually will happen is that these bees will share warmth across that divider board, hopefully helping them to survive harsher winters better because they're sharing warmth across this divider board. That's one of these key aspects of having nukes, double nukes, where the bees are sharing walls. And this should be very efficient for them to share the heat and the warmth from one cluster to the other. And the key here is to put the entrances close to this divider board between the 2 halves of the hive. The ultimate idea is that during the winter, the bees will share warmth by setting up their clusters near the entrances, near where the brood is, because the brood is made near these entrances, and the clusters will then be near each other across this divider board. And other than that, the width of this brood box is the width of 4 8-frame standard boxes. Now, there's going to be roughly 16, 17 frames that can be put on each side of this bottom brood box, which could be enough if someone just wanted to just use this as a long hive. Well, let me bring down the frames so we can take a look at this. Here, okay, so here I have put in the frames into the brood box. But I wanted to set up here to show that on one side, I'm going to put 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Normally in a long horizontal hive, you'll have 9 to 12 frames set aside for brood. And then everything beyond that will be the honey reserves. So we can imagine that in these frames that I have selected here that are showing up in a blue color, that's where the brood would be. And then to the left of that would normally be honey reserves. Now, a beekeeper could just work with this, and as the frames to the left are filled up, the beekeeper takes them out, harvests the honey, and just replaces the frames. So in this design, you really actually don't need to put supers on top. But I'm going to show that it is possible to put supers on top if a beekeeper wants to. So what I'm going to do now is bring down queen excluders and put it over this base so that we can start putting supers on top. Now remember, the supers aren't going to be necessary because you could just use the honey reserves off to the side, off to the end here. Okay, now we see that the queen excluders are on. These are normal 8-frame size queen excluders put right on top of that base box. And keep in mind now that the top of this hive at this point in time would be around 30 inches, which is still very low for most people. It's only around 30 inches, easily to work with. So there's no problem here as far as the height. And we're going to add on a medium supers. And the supers are only going to add another 6 inches onto the height. So from about 30 to 36 inches will be the height. And 36 inches is really very comfortable for someone to work with. And of course, the height of the legs can be adjusted to the person working the hives. But right now we're going to bring down the supers. All right, so now we see that there's 4 8-frame medium supers put on top of the bottom box. So this allows the bees to continue to fill up frames. At this point in time, what we are looking at here would be a hive that would be considered 2 brood boxes and 2 supers up on top, which would be a hive stacked 4 boxes high. And for most backyard beekeepers, having 4 boxes is plenty for a hive. So this would be the extent, and then frames can be pulled off and harvested as need be, or just left. But there would be plenty of honey supply, honey reserves left over for the winter to allow the bees to fill up all of these frames with honey. So now we're going to bring down a design and put on a design here for a feeder shim. This is an idea from Frederick Dunn, who has a YouTube channel, Frederick Dunn. And so I'm taking his feeder shim design and just putting it right on top. And I'm gonna change a few little things and add a few little ideas to his feeder shim. Okay, so these feeder shims are going to look a little complicated, and it's going to be probably a little complicated to describe them, but these are based on Frederick Dunn's feeder shims, who has a video describing these. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of these. As we look into this shim, which is basically a box, and in the bottom of the box you'll have a base, and on that base we'll have holes drilled. Let's go ahead and look underneath at the bottom. You'll see that the bottom of these feeder shims have 4 holes drilled in them. And there's also a base of 3/8 inch to give bee space so the bees can walk underneath this feeder shim, this feeder box, and above the frames on the super or on the brood box, because these feeder shims can be put directly onto the brood box down below or directly onto the supers up above, either or. And they have 4 holes in them. 2 of the holes, the larger holes, will be set aside for 2 rapid round feeders, and the other 2 holes can be set aside for ventilation. Now here on the side, we have holes for ventilation. There's holes in the front, holes in the back, and depending on the wind direction, you can close off and open up different ventilation holes to allow the wind to flow better through the hive, where the wind actually blows over the hive and pulls air up and through out these ventilation holes. And you can actually learn to control the flow of the ventilation better by opening and closing these ventilation holes, these vents. So as we look inside, we'll see that there's 2 rapid round feeders, and maybe one could have pollen patties, the other could have syrup, or they could both have dry sugar in the wintertime. There's options to have different types of feed inside these rapid rounds. In these areas where you have these little towers, these little square towers with mesh on top, some screen mesh, those are like chimneys that help pull the air, the moist hot air, from the bees upwards into this ventilation. And then that air will flow out these holes to ventilate the hive. So here you have it, a ventilation system and a feeder system all through this one shim. If you look down below, there will be space for pollen patties to be put between this feeder shim and the frames, because most beekeepers would want to have those pollen patties very close to the brood and not up in the rapid round feeders. Now there's just one other thing I'd want to add here about these feeder shims. The way I have them set up here is, looking through on the internet, in these upper boxes, some beekeepers just throw sawdust, and that's for insulation above the cluster. So what you could actually do in a situation like this is throw sawdust in between the rapid rounds and these little towers, these little chimney towers. You could throw sawdust in between them up to about 3 inches. The rapid rounds in this case are about 3.5 inches tall. They're from Glory Bee. This type of rapid round comes up 3.5 inches tall. And these little chimneys are about 3 inches to 3.5 inches tall. So you could throw in sawdust around these to help insulate the hive. And then above that, you leave a clearer space above these little chimneys and above these rapid round feeders where you could throw in crumpled paper, burlap, other more breathable type material so that the hot air can come up these chimneys and then flow out through these ventilation holes. And this is the idea here is that you use, I haven't seen this on any videos. This is something I've blended between some beekeepers throw in sawdust and other beekeepers throw in burlap or paper, shredded paper. But you can actually blend the two. So in the bottom half of this feeder shim, you're throwing in sawdust to give better insulation above the cluster. But then above that sawdust, you're throwing in a more breathable material like burlap or shredded paper or something else. So you actually end up having two air spaces in this upper shim. A lower space, which is better for insulating above the cluster, and then a more breathable airspace between these ventilation holes and the tops of these chimneys that allow the air to come through. I was seeing on some videos that air was rushing through these ventilation holes and creating moisture and dropping like raindrops onto the materials. So a critical thing here is that Frederick Dunn picked up on this too, is that you really want to slow down air movement in this upper area where like above the sawdust in this example, you really want to slow it down. So he puts like a metal scrubs for the kitchen to clean dishes. He puts those into these ventilation holes to slow it down. But you could also put in paper or burlap in this upper area above the sawdust to really slow down that air movement because that cold air is going to want to rush in. But the thing is, you really want that moist hot air to come up and work its way out slowly and breathe its way out without having cold air rushing in really fast with some moisture and creating drops that'll come down onto the beehive. So all this system is very protective of the bees, allows good ventilation, allows feeders. It's a good combination. So now we're going to go on to the roof. That's all that's left is just to put on the roof, which is a gable roof. Let me go ahead and bring that down. Okay, so here we have the feeder shims put on top of the hive. And remember, those could just go on directly on top of the brood box down below. And then we have a simple gable roof with 1/2 inch insulation on the bottom, inside the bottom. Go inside here. What you see up here is 1/2 inch insulation with 1/2 inch plywood up above it, which gives an extra layer of insulation for the hide in the summer and the winter. So the cold and the heat can be controlled with this type of gable roof. So if we come in here and we can actually go inside the roof to check out the design. So as we come in, we'll see that there's an empty airspace with air that can flow from one side to the other. So all of this space here inside the gable roof can trap heat and then carry that heat away before it goes down to the hive below. So when the sun is directly above, blazing its heat directly onto this roof, this little airspace up here will trap the heat and pull it away with insulation down below it so that heat won't go to the hive and it'll help them in those hot, hot days with the sun. So that's the basic roof there. And that would just come right on down onto the hive. And now you get the full view of what the hive would look like. From the base, where the trays can go for monitoring mites, that dead air space down below, so that the cold air can settle in during the winter time and not touch the bottom of the cluster. Then you have your two brood boxes here, where the bees, each hive is clustering close to the center, sharing heat. And then you have the supers put on top with the queen excluders. So if somebody just wants to have pure honey reserves for themselves for harvesting, they can do that. Then you have your feeder shims set right on top with the feeders and the roof. So it's a very simple design, complete design, and very simple.